do I met these friends from the church who were ambitious and aspirational and also strong value system. And I remember one of them saying to me one night, "Come over to my house on Friday night. I'm studying through the night." I said, "You do what through the night?"
I was the first person from my family to go to University of Cape Town, which was a big deal because it's a white institution. First few months was an absolute horror. I genuinely thought, what on earth am I doing here?
Well, the vast difference between South Africa and Zimbabwe is that they followed obviously the British curriculum. So yes, the material, the content was very Eurocentric. Even reading history, you focused on world history, European history, American history, and I know a lot about your previous presidents, which is not very useful in an African context.
I was planning on going into business, doing the whole McKinsey type management consulting, be rich, buy yachts and islands, and then had a bit of a personal crisis that was linked to kind of thinking about the world and thinking about my place in the world and growing up in South Africa and all of that stuff. And I think through that process ended up moving into education and realizing that things are actually only really meaningful, or I think life is only really meaningful to the extent that it's lived for the benefit of other people.
So my father, for example, was forced out of his home thrice during his lifetime, and experienced apartheid head on. You literally get told, "We have now declared this area whites only area. You need to find a new home and get out." And the family lost their family farm. I mean, it was as severe as that. And I can't imagine what that must have done to him as a human being.
The Cape Flats is a particularly brutal story.
I grew up on the Cape Flats of South Africa, which is just sort of a place where black people were displaced to as a result of apartheid, and in particular as a result of what was called forced removals.
So the social fibre and the fabric is completely destroyed during this process.
So you ended up on this windswept area of the Cape Flats in which there was every conceivable social ill, from drugs to gangs to, and that of course meant that your life was in danger all the time as you tried to figure out how to survive. People literally laid their lives on the line for education.
We spoke about the 3 labor laws applicable to workers in South Africa.
People made huge sacrifices. To this day, poor people make huge sacrifices so that the kids get a reasonable quality of education. 1994, of course, came therefore with the promise that all the sacrifices that were made, for education, among other things, were now going to be met.
And the climate, of course, Nelson Mandela had been released. We were all highly euphoric. We were all very happy with each other. We were the Rainbow Nation, and we were all going to get along splendidly.
Where everyone has equal access and equal opportunity. A socially upwardly mobile society where, based on your own hard work and talents and abilities, you'd be able to get ahead.
And of course, that didn't go according to plan. I think it's because it happened so easily, and because it happened without any real major societal disturbance, we didn't quite realize the magnitude of what was happening. And of course, with Nelson Mandela embodying every sort of goodness and this almost surreal capacity to forgive, we got taken along with him. And I think it didn't allow us the necessary time and moment of mourning in terms of the loss of humanity which we had suffered as a collective.
Everything was swept under the carpet, and that was a ridiculous thing to do because the real hurts and the real issues were never then discussed. And now it's manifesting in a very different form.
The ANC was smart enough to know that if they wanted to embark on democracy, one of the key things they needed to do was to change education.
And of course it didn't happen. Okay, and one of the reasons it didn't happen was because the people heading up education were not people who knew anything about education by and large, okay? It wasn't based on expertise, it was based on loyalty to the ruling party, or what South Africans called cadre deployment. You deployed the loyalists to all these senior positions in government. Big mistake, okay? Because they didn't know, for example, how to change schools.
This is what people don't get about our system. It was never about education. It was never about giving kids a real education. It had to do with citizenship. It had to do with cultivating a particular kind of society. And the ANC was going to use whatever vehicle necessary.
Even though you deracialize schools, you say no one is allowed to discriminate based on race. Now they just discriminate based on if you can pay the fees. So there is a clause in the South African Schools Act that says you're not allowed to turn away kids if you can't pay fees. And yet 99.7% of kids don't receive that fee exemption. So in other words, another way of saying that is almost all the students that attend fee charging schools actually pay the fees. So we have now had a system that was split on race under apartheid. If you were white, you had access to good teachers and high quality schools, whereas post-apartheid, we still have these kind of two school systems, but now it's split on parents' ability to pay. So can you pay for the fees? Can you pay for the education that you want your child to get? Because if you can't, you won't get it.
Look, it's a disaster. You basically have two education systems.
So I mentioned the fee charging schools. Those make up maybe only 15% of schools in the country. And then you have another kind of 75 to 80% of schools that are no-fee schools, that are largely dysfunctional, extremely dysfunctional schools. And the learning outcomes in those two different systems are radically, radically different. So if you're in a very wealthy, either a private school or a high-fee charging public school, because those are the same thing. Do you know what I mean? The distinction in South Africa isn't public versus private. The distinction in South Africa is fee charging versus no-fee schools.
So it's black and white middle-class kids by and large. Okay, in highly functional schools in South Africa, schools that look like the best schools in the world. And you know, within 10 kilometers of those schools, you can be in a shack school. Within 10 kilometers of those unbelievably, those estate schools, you can be in a place where children still drown in pit latrines. Now, for me, this is fundamentally unjust, okay?
So your typical privileged child would have access to a normal home where there are books, writing materials, possibly a mother and father, whereas your typical black kid is not going to have that. Mother disappeared a few years ago. Father was killed during the apartheid protest. Child-headed homes is prevalent. So the playing fields were never equal, but there was an assumption that it was, which continues to bite us.
But right now, we're in a mess. Because if only 20% of the kids have access not just to cultural capital, but to money, to real capital, and the rest get left behind, you don't need to be a prophet to see trouble coming down the road, okay? And it's exactly what's happening right now in the country.
it's starting to crack, and it will crack very quickly, and it's going to be actually quite a disaster. Because how are you going to rectify all of that?
We have NGOs taking our government to court to get them to implement their own norms and standards. Tells me that there's something wrong. And part of that wrong has got to do with that the ANC in particular has not fully understood what it means to transition from an oppositional force to a government. They haven't fully understood that. And the lack of accountability is staggering. And so you have ministers in key positions who will not be doing their jobs, but because of political reasons, they stay.
Every single year, they have reports on these books that are sitting and waiting to actually be deployed to these schools. And this for me is actually, it's criminal.
To look into something called the Jobs for Cash scandal, where teachers' posts and principal posts were actually being sold for money and for livestock.
And what you really need in South Africa is the type of government that says, the party stops today.
Politically, education has become the ball that's been kicked around. And it's about access, and absolutely. Are more kids in school? Yeah. Are there more rural schools? Yes, absolutely. Are farm schools been taken care of? Yes. Have there been changes? Yes, there have been. Have there been enough? No. Why haven't there been enough? Because lack of political will.
There are no consequences when people don't do their jobs. This could be high-level government officials that are meant to eradicate mud schools and inadequate sanitation, and they don't do that. There's no consequence, right? We have children that in South Africa that have drowned in pit latrines. So this is in their own excrement, and people are not fired as a result of this. There's no accountability that results when there's mass failure in a system.
So a simple thing like, I pay your salary, therefore you show up. I mean, a very basic thing. You can't guarantee that in South Africa, largely because of the teachers' union.
I think the main accountability constraint that we have in South Africa is undue union influence. So the majority union in South Africa is SATU, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, and they are in a formal ruling alliance with the ANC. So that's the main accountability constraint, I think, undue union influence in the way that appointments are made, in the types of policies that do or don't get rolled out. All of those things are actually being dictated to the department by the union.
And every time the results show that our kids are not performing, we change the policy. Instead of saying, what is the root of the problem? And the root of the problem is that our teachers are not teaching. And we are not holding them accountable.
Teachers in South Africa actually don't have the content knowledge that we are asking them to teach their students, right? So there was a nationally representative survey of grade 6 teachers in South Africa, the SACMEC study, and it found that 79% of grade 6 maths teachers couldn't do grade 6 maths. 60% of grade 5 kids can't do the most basic maths that we can think of. 78% of grade 4 students in South Africa are not literate. They cannot read for meaning in any language, even in their home language.
We, in this country, we have a very high percentage of unqualified and underqualified teachers. What does that mean? That means that because of apartheid, a lot of the schools in black townships were started by black community leaders with the best of intentions, right? Because the kids, the nearest school would be 30, 40 kilometers away. It's not possible. So you'd start a local school in your own home, which would be a shack, and you'd get other good-minded people to come and teach. And slowly but surely over years, this thing expands into what is now referred to as a school. But the people running it never have formal qualifications.
The majority of kids don't learn the most basic skills in primary school. They don't learn to use numbers in logical and meaningful ways, and they can't read for meaning.
So if you think about it at the elementary level, what does a kid need? You need a teacher in every subject who is qualified and competent. You need a textbook in every subject that challenges you intellectually. You need a predictable timetable. In other words, not only is there a teacher, but the teacher shows up. Okay, everyday teacher. Those are things you would assume to be basic things that should exist in any school system. We don't have it.
Being a teacher is a calling. It's not just about paying your bills, getting a job. It's a calling. And you need to be actually motivated. You need to be, you need to want to make the change.
The majority of South Africans are actually living in a form of poverty, more than 70%. If I went into many South African classrooms, it would absolutely break me to try and reform what's going on. The amount of social problems that many of the students have, the communities that they're coming from, it's not just a case of, oh, this is the curriculum and I just need to cover these lessons. When students are coming with, there's personal traumas, widespread, very high levels of violence, in some communities in South Africa, abuse, parents who are not able to be as involved as they would like for structural reasons.
In a place like Lavender Hill, you know what one of the most basic needs is of teachers? To stay alive. Because it's the one area in South Africa in which you are likely to be shot on your way to school, either as a student or a teacher.
The huge struggle there is that children never see the end result of a good education, because those who achieve, those who actually go on to tertiary and make something of their lives, do not live in Lavender Hill. You're not going to find somebody who's making a good living move back into Lavender Hill. They leave, right? So parents and kids never see the end story. They might know about it, but it's not visible, right? So all they see is that particular housing scheme, that particular landscape, those particular gunshots every day. However, the little bit of success they do see is located with the gangster, isn't it? He's the only guy that has the BMW. He's the guy with the nice tackies, the Levi jeans. He's the guy that's got the gold chains. So he must have the money. Now, how did he get that? Oh, he sold drugs. And that's what happens.
The pervasive nature of gangsterism, once you are in, it's almost impossible to get out.
If 500,000 kids, mainly boys, drop out of school between grades 2 and 12 in every cycle of 12 years, that's what's happening right now. They don't just drop out into outer space. They drop into gangs.
As soon as you try and achieve a little bit more than that, you're going to find from within those communities, you're going to be pulled back all the time. And it's almost like a vicious circle. So you have that gangster culture on the one hand, who are basically at the moment ruling many of the schools in the Cape Flats.
I think the main lesson when you look at the South African education system for a global audience would be around inequality. So the gap between the wealthiest 10% of South Africa and the poorest 90%, the size of that gap is the largest in the world. The starkness of the inequality is so vast, so drastic, that you see in stark relief, oh, this is what it looks like to have an unequal education system. And the types of lessons that you learn from looking at a South African education system about where teachers go, who gets employed when and why, the kind of resource flows that happen between different schools, those things are so obvious in South Africa that many other countries can look and be like, oh wow, I wonder if ours also work like that.
The value system that I grew up in goes like this. Your child is not safe until everybody's child is safe. You know, that's so fundamental to me.
Slightly less than half of students in South Africa will drop out. Only 40% of them will get the school leaving exam. Only 12 of them, of 100 kids, so only 12% will actually go to university. And only 6 will get an undergraduate qualification.
So the country needs to have a functional education system for all kids. Otherwise, you don't have democracy. Downstream, you don't have decency. You don't have development.
But the fact that the state spends such a very large amount of money on education, if we just spent that in more effective and efficient ways, we'd be able to solve so many of the problems that we currently have. Good intentions don't make kids read. Good interventions do.
Education allows you to engage with people that you would never have encountered. It broadens who you are. It deepens who you are. So it's about opportunity. It's about allowing people the chance to be something else.
I think it's very difficult to live a dignified life if you don't acquire basic skills like being able to read. So engaging with the world in the 21st century is not possible in a meaningful way if you cannot read.
The lesson that I have today when I speak to young people across South Africa and in other parts of the world is, there's actually nothing wrong with you. You actually have incredible talent. You actually know a lot. You can do great things. The problem is the messaging system. The stuff that gets into your head messes you up. So, for example, in South Africa, you have a school system that allows kids to pass with 30% and 40% in some subjects. That in and of itself is bad, but what's really bad is the messaging system that we don't expect much from you.
Education is about allowing the opportunity for absolutely everybody. And it has to be done with hope.
Using the education system and schooling as a vehicle for change is a really powerful narrative in South Africa, which a lot of people would buy into. There's also other vehicles of how you do social change: radical land redistribution, radical wealth redistribution, which I think are actually politically more difficult to accomplish than things like educational reform.
No matter what people say, no matter how they try to stop you, you need to get that education, because the education is the only key to get out of a lot of these situations.
So I think the main way that I would try and motivate people is to get them to understand just how bad a very large part of our education system is. So many people that of the middle class have no idea how bad the schooling system is for the majority of people. And I think if they actually saw them, if they actually walked into a school and sat down with a kid and tried to read with them, or ask them questions, and they saw just how bad it was, they would be like, we can't carry on like this. Just from a basic level, we cannot carry on like this. We need to do something about this. There needs to be a bit of a Marshall Plan that says we need to fix the system in quite radical ways.